right, so are you ready for some hot and spicy content? So the hot and spicy are some Java tools that I found very useful. And the hot part is on Hawt IO, and the spicy stuff is Jolokia, named after a chili. So my name is Martin Skarsaune. I'm a developer from Norway. I work for a small or medium-sized consultancy company there. So I'm just your regular Java guy. Usually I don't spend too much on this, but I think this year I could mention some fun stuff from the company I work for, because last summer some colleagues of mine ended up as actors in a thing that went viral. So if you've not seen this, or you find my presentation unsatisfying, you can spend some time Googling the mysterious life of developers, which is sort of introducing us as a species to the outside world. And for not only developers to be the sort of people in our company made fun of, we have had a follow-up this year for some other people. So you can check that out if you like. So the stuff I would like to cover will be then based on demonstrating these tools. So first I would just go a quick sort of intro to what kind of tools they are and what they offer. And that should, if you don't know these tools from before, that should get you an impression. Or if you already know them, you might find some other features you're not aware of. How many here have been using either Jolokia or Hawt IO in the past? So there's a few, but maybe new stuff for most of you. And then I would just show a little bit about how this is built and how that enabled us to use this in different ways and interact with it in different ways. Then we will look at another strong point of Hawt IO, which is the rich set of plugins that cover lots of Java solutions out there. And then from there on, we can move on to see how you can make benefit of this for your own application. Not just the general stuff, both by a convention, but also how you could create a plugin of your own that's specific to your application. And then the next step from that is, if you have then a need that you think is useful for others, how you could also contribute back into the project by creating more plugins. So that's this sort of mandatory experimental thing that can go horribly wrong that any presentation should have. And then in the end, if we have time, we can if there's other things you would like me to show. And also I think since it's based on demonstrating, it's very good if I go too fast or something is not clear that you just interrupt. It's better that way than we skip some content. And I will be at my laptop here, so just shout out if there's a problem. So as a sort of intro, just to explain what kind of tools these are, they have then some similarities to other management tools you will know from your bin folder in your Java installation. Are you familiar with some of these tools, I guess? Different generations. So Hawt IO and Jolokia aims to do some stuff similar and some stuff a little bit differently from these other tools. I think we should get started. So what you can do is you can just go to a Hawt IO webpage, hawt.io, to get started. If you want a rule to remember the spelling, it's have a wonderful time, for instance. And there's a getting started page. So there's a number of ways you can do this. I will be showing the two most plain ones that don't have any dependencies on anything else. It's running a standalone jar or using a WAR file. But if you like what you see today and you would like to use this, I encourage you to study this whole page, because there could be some support for it, or a preferred way to do it, like if you're using Spring Boot or some different stack. So you just download the jar file and you fire it up. Yes. So I was a bit cowardly today. There's just been a new release, but I'm running a stable one, since I did not have time to get into everything with the new one. And so it will start up a Java process, and a tab will appear in your browser. So you see this is browser-based. This is my Chrome installation. One place to start could be a dashboard, where you find similar stuff as other management tools, some graphs and stuff. And we'll later see how you can customize the dashboards. There's something called runtime, which just gives you an overview of what process this is. We will later see how you can connect to different processes. So it's important to know what Java virtual machine you're looking at. If you can see it in the tab here as well, you have the process ID of the Java virtual machine, if you have several ones in your browser. You can, for instance, look at system properties. When you see a table like this, it's you can always sort, and if there's a box like this, you can filter the contents. That's for all tables. You can look at the threads. Similarly, you can filter. You can look at stack frames, monitors, and so on for threads, as you would in other management tools. You also have a more recent addition is the diagnostics tab. And here you can get more in-depth information. Like, for instance, if you want to use the flight recorder in your virtual machine. And for instance, this virtual machine was not launched with commercial options, but you can click a button to unlock those at runtime, and you could start recordings and save them and stop. So then you could then take this file into Java Mission Control to look for profiling and things like that. For all of these commands, you can also, if you have console access to your Java application, it will show you what commands you can use to achieve the similar effect, or the same effect. I can also make some settings, and also for, the flight recorder is going open source, but for earlier versions, you should be aware that you need a license for certain Oracle VMs to use it. You could also look at the memory in the heap. You can get a class histogram of all the classes that are loaded and their instances. And you could repeat this operation and see changes over time. You can also filter here, but it's rather slow. But you could, and you also then have the ability to open it in an IDE if you want to look at the source code of certain classes there. Let's see. And all of this, all the stuff you see, is then based on JMX. And JMX is a subsystem of Java. It's part of the virtual machine, where in both the platform, libraries you use your own code, you can expose certain information in what's called an MBean. And the MBeans then can have attributes and operations. So for instance, we have, you can see attributes here. If you have, for instance, it's nothing. You could also, let's see, if you have some attributes that's writable, you can then at runtime change the value. You can also execute operations. Like for instance, there's a separate tab for operations. If you want to request a garbage collect, for instance, you can do that through the interface here. Similar to existing MBean browsers that you may know about. There's also, if some attributes are numeric, like we see here for the threading, we have some of those. There's also support for charting them over time, and you can then see this timeline, what the value was at certain times, and it's possible to select which ones you want, and you can also say that you want to include that view into a dashboard. One important thing here is that these dashboards are front-end technology. It's JavaScript running in your browser, so the history is not kept. Right. So if I want this graph, I should find a way to save that away. If I reload here, that the counters here will sort of be reset. So I think that's sort of the basic stuff. You can see if we have, yes, so we have dashboards. You can look at threads. We have JMX browser, diagnostics. There's maybe one little issue, feature in diagnostics. That's you have the options for the virtual machine as well. And they are maybe a bit cryptic, but you may recognize some of them. These are options you can set at the command line when you launch a VM, but there's also some of them that you can change at runtime. So for instance, if we want to have a heap dump on out of memory, we can also toggle that at runtime, so you don't need to restart the process if you need that functionality to be active. Yes, okay, so one of the ways this is different from the existing tools is the way that the tool connects to the Java virtual machine. So if you use a traditional tool like JConsole, one typical use is as a developer, you're launching a Java process and you're launching JConsole and attaching to that local process on the same host, same user. If you want to use it remotely, there's a number of command line options you need to specify up front for it to be accessible over the wire. In addition, that communication is based on RMI protocol, which is it's not so easy to work with. Like you need in addition to the open port you're listening on, you also negotiate another port for the actual communication. So firewalls and network-wise, it's a bit of a hassle. And in addition, your client that introspects the VM has to be written in Java. You cannot use other tools. Whereas we saw Hawt IO is then user interface written for the browser. So the way that we are able to connect to this virtual machine is there's where the Jolokia component comes into the picture. So Jolokia will run inside the virtual machine you're looking at. So from within the VM, you have full access to the JMX, and then it will expose a simple web interface over HTTP with just URLs and JSON payloads going back and forth. So we can see how we can make use of the same. So if we looked at some of the beans we just saw, for instance, so if you have an attribute here, on the details of that, it actually shows us the URL that Hawt IO will use to access this. And that means that we could also get access to that information. So you can see the payload like this. And we could even we can use a path to sort of drill down into the result if you're looking for a simple value and so on. And same for if we have an operation. This information is also easily accessible. So you can also have stuff executed within your virtual machine. If you have more advanced things, you can use post requests to do sort of, for instance, method calls with several parameters or things like that, chain several requests and so on. So it's pretty intuitive and straightforward. So the advantage is that for like if you want to do some monitoring or something, you can just curl into this. You don't need to fire up a Java virtual machine just to access the information from JMX. And so that's basically the coverage I have of Jolokia. There's some more resources out there. But in short, it uses HTTP. You have clear text JSON payloads that are easily accessible. There's also more modern support for authenticating and managing what MBeans and not you are able to access than traditional JMX, which is basically all or nothing. I also have references to this later. All right. So the fact that this is split into this front end and back end, which are loosely coupled, it opens many different ways for us to use this in modern settings. So what we just saw when I did that standalone jar, that sort of has a web app that runs in an embedded Jetty. So far we've just been looking at the Hawt IO process itself, which is not so interesting. What we want to do is look at your own application that's deployed somewhere. And there are different ways to do that. One way, if you're using a sort of traditional web container and you have applications running, you can just drop the WAR file in there and then it gets access to it because it's living in the same VM. But I guess nowadays many people rather run executable jars or something or some other way to launch the Java process. So what we want is to get in there. And for that to be possible, we need Jolokia to be running inside it. And as for Hawt IO, the Jolokia documentation also has sort of getting started, different ways to do it. But I will use the most common and sort of versatile way, which is what's called a Java agent. A Java agent is a Java library that can run inside your Java virtual machine, side by side with your application. And there are basically two ways to get it in there. You could either specify on the command line when you start that you want to run a certain agent, or you can use what's called dynamic attach, so that if you have access to the process, you can at runtime attach the agent to it. So that in that case, you can then from your Hawt IO say that you want to attach to this VM. It will then leave or fire up a Jolokia inside there, and from that point, you can then access that process through an HTTP connection to that VM instead. There's also a Chrome plugin if you don't want to launch a separate Java process, but it's kind of outdated, so I typically stick with the executable jar for the latest features. So in the Hawt IO we just saw, there's a tab called Connect. So here we have different ways to do it. If you have like a fixed setup, you know where the Jolokia agent runs. You can store connections, so you would now know the host and the port number and so on, and you can save this. They're saved in your browser's local storage, so then the settings here are only available in your browser. Or we could say, like we just saw, that connect to local process. We have it uses the same Java features to see other running processes as other Java tools like JConsole or JPS, where we can then say that we want to start an agent that will find a free port, and you can just click to connect to it. Then there's the third way, which is that Jolokia has built-in capability to make its presence known if you enable it, so that different Java virtual machines with Jolokia in your network can then, so you can listen for those messages, and so it will scan the network interfaces and come up with the available processes. So if you're like in a dynamically scaled setup or something, this could be useful. Also, Jolokia probes the VM it runs, looking for certain known Java technologies. So it will, for instance, figure out that this is a Jetty, this is a Tomcat and its version, and an active MQ, for instance. For any other project process, it's just a generic Java process. If you have authentication specified, you can enter that. This green button is for attaching to it. If it's open, we will also preemptively get some information out of there. For instance, when the VM was started and the command that launched it. So if you have a large list of processes, this can be a help to connect to the correct one. So you just click here, and then you get a separate tab. So now we got a new tab, and you could maybe see that it's a different process ID from the one we came from. So if that was a bit quick, I've also tried to sort of summarize that. The simplest case is it runs in a known location, fixed location. You just connect to it. You can also look for other Java processes and attach to them. You start the agent, the Jolokia agent in it, and you connect to it. At the previous client, we were running Java as Windows services. And that's a case where you're not able to do this because that runs as a different user than your interactive user. In which case, a workaround you could have then like a Tomcat with Hawt IO also as a Windows service, and you could make this ad hoc connections, for instance. There are ways like that. And then the third kind where the different instances let you know that they are there. So that was the sort of flexibility of connecting. But I think the real strong point for Hawt IO is the support for many known Java frameworks. And this is how I got to know about it the first time, and it's really a lifesaver in some situations. So I will show that. There's in the source code of Hawt IO, there is a example application that contains a lot of, has sort of bundle a little bit of everything just to demonstrate. So what you have here is that with Hawt IO there's a number of plugins shipped, and if given the presence of certain things in your Java process, it will you will have several tabs appear here, like ActiveMQ, embedded ActiveMQ, which, and if you don't know the particular technologies, that's not the point. The point is to show how the tool can give you a valuable insight. So for instance, if you have an ActiveMQ, you can look at the queues. You can, it just seems to be a bit strange offset there. I'll just try to reload it. Yeah, so if you have a queue here, you can look at messages and so on and do various things with them. If anybody know Apache Camel, which is it's like an integration framework for routing messages here and there. That's an example of a very powerful tool, but once you've deployed it, it can be hard sometimes to know what goes on inside, and then you can have some insight into what's actually going on inside there, like where messages go and so on. Loads of stuff you can do. You can test by putting messages on stuff and so on. So it's really crucial to have control of that. Yeah, there's some other examples here. If you're using Quartz, for instance, Quartz is it's like a cron daemon for Java, if you're not familiar with it. So you have some information about the schedulers and so on. And for the trigger here, you could then at runtime, for instance, change the cron expression or what to do, so you don't need to redeploy. You can also, if you're testing, you can actually manually trigger a Quartz trigger. So you see the time here of the previous fire now. So you don't need to set very short intervals or something to have things fire. You can manually fire stuff. Yeah, so that's some example of some known things that I put in support for. Spring Boot is another one. You get some introspection into the beans and so on. Yeah, so all the plugins, they provide a very good support for various things, and I will see later how you can easily add more plugins to the project. And whether a certain tab appears or not depends on the presence of mbeans. It's just a user interface on top of JMX. So for instance, for ActiveMQ, for Camel, I would be able to do the same things if I went into the mbean browser and looked for attributes and operations. But then I would need to know where to find it. So what the plugins do is they give you a visualization and figure out all the tiny details for you. Okay, so now we've seen how it can support ordinary Java things, like monitoring the process, and also the support for third-party frameworks. And we could have a short look at, so say you have an application and you want to expose something that's specific to your application. And that, since it's based on JMX, that means you need to expose some JMX out of your application. So really simple case is JMX is available in Java. So now I just show a pretty naive way to just expose something. We will later see that maybe in your stack you have some better support for it, but here's just a naive line that should work in any Java application. You look for a what's called an mbean server, and you register bean. In this case, we register our own object, and then we need what's called a domain, which could be a package name, and some other qualifiers. So this is basically what you see in the JMX here, that you have these domains and you have some qualifiers for each bean. And in addition, so this is the good old way to do it, and it's also based on a convention. So my class has this name, then it needs to implement an interface with a particular suffix. And within that interface, sort of Java Bean conventions is used. So if it's getters and setters, it will be attributes. If it's anything else, it will be operations. So in our case, we then make use of something that's already built into Hawt IO. So this bean we get this sort of health dashboard just by, and the clue there is to call whatever your mbean service and the name health. It will be picked up. So you could have different kinds of things just showing up here magically. Instead of maybe creating your own visualization, if you're happy with it. If not, we can proceed to do what's called a dynamic plugin, which is so in addition to what Hawt IO does well for general stuff, you can have your own specific handling for your application. And the way that works is by you would typically create a separate web app, and in that application you then write some front-end code to represent the front end to your management stuff. And as a technical thing, you then need to instantiate an mbean. You need an mbean to expose your management stuff, and you need another mbean to tell Hawt IO that here's a plugin. So then Hawt IO will scan the mbean tree and find that, okay, this is a plugin bean which points to certain resources, and then we'll load those in as part of the application. So it's a very impressive example. We have a plugin that shows one attribute of the application and exposes one management operation. So we have, yeah, that's basically it. So here you could build, I guess, even more advanced stuff. And the way you do that, first we need to expose something. Let me see. And in this case, it's a Spring application. So then you could use some annotations to achieve the same. So I have a Spring bean here that I say is a managed resource, and then So this is basically the similar to the one liner we saw earlier to publish the bean. So now Spring will do the heavy lifting, and you can have methods then annotated with attribute or operation. So now these will appear on that mbean that Spring exposes for us. And the code to do this, and so Hawt IO comes with some example plugins. They're written in Angular. I'm certainly not a front-end guy, so my point here is not maybe to show all the details, but show how you could just copy that template and make a few small changes to adapt to your application, and then everything else you can just sort of get for free. So it's a JavaScript file which has something that's documented. So I said that you typically have a dedicated web app for the plugin. So this here then just points to that context path. I did not show, I could have shown that this is running in Tomcat. So here we say we have deployed Hawt IO, and we have our application. And in addition, we have a plugin for our application. I think this also makes sense to, these are separate concerns. You could put it, of course, in your application if it's a web application, but the plugin is sort of a side issue and not your application code. So there we have need a reference to where those front-end resources are located. And then there's 2 lines here where we specify our mbean that we saw, that we exposed. And thereon it's more or less just boilerplate. Here's one thing that you can also copy just to explain. This is the thing that makes this tab either appear or not appear. So I can have this plugin running all the time, but it's only when it's connected to my example application that that tab will show up. And then there's all the stuff that sort of binds my mbean data to that web page. It's in this controller here. Again, this is very schematic. When we say register, then we will pull Jolokia at whatever the user has specified in the user interface, like every 5 seconds. So your attributes will get refreshed. So this is also according to template. And then you can have a render function, and this is where your own stuff goes in. So if you want to pick certain things out of your mbean and put them on the scope and refresh. And similarly, when we did the push button, we can expose the function. And here we need to, it's the same mbean, but we specify this function, and that's its exec. And in the same, here you will then write a little HTML snippet that exposes our attributes and provides a button that you can push. So you can, if you have like some management insights or housekeeping of your application, instead of maybe creating dedicated stuff for that in your application, you could consider using this. Then you get all the benefits of the connectivity of Jolokia and Hawt IO and get it into the same place. Yeah, to recap that, it's a separate web app. We register it via the backend as an mbean. I could maybe just show that part as well. That you hook into some code that gets triggered at some point, and you instantiate the Hawt IO plugin that points to these resources, and then Hawt IO will be able to load it in as part of its interface. Yes. And then if you have sort of, or you're using a third-party thing that you don't feel the support is good enough for, you can also quite easily add plugins to the Hawt IO itself. And we have, I have an example of that. I think I will not, maybe not show the code there, but just what you could achieve as an example. One area which is pretty common, I guess, is Spring. Many applications are built on Spring. For Spring Boot, you have some introspection, but for any regular other Spring applications, not necessarily. So this uses a new feature in Jolokia 2.0, where you could have other sources of information than JMX. So in this case, we have existing JMX mbeans here, but there's a new category called Spring, and these are not actually mbeans, they are data that Jolokia presents based on Spring beans. And then we could, for instance, have this visualization of the Spring graph. And we could maybe exclude some stuff to get it out. But here we could see if we find any interesting things. Like, I thought I had an example somewhere. Well, it just basically shows how confusing these applications can get, and here you can then can hover and see the various settings of beans. And if I go to one bean, let's see if I make it work. I could access it, and I could even modify stuff. It's pretty, yeah. It's not, doesn't support everything, but it just shows the kind of things you could do based on the same sort of stack with Jolokia serving information about the application and Hawt IO doing specific things with it. Yeah, I think that's mostly covers it. So nice things about Hawt IO. You find flexible and simple connectivity, which is maybe more suited for these deployment situations we have now. The front end is independent, and there's a rich set of plugins to introspect certain Java technologies, and the extensibility is endless. I could like this thing I just showed. As an example. So what you would do if you add a plugin, you just add another subfolder, and you add your JavaScript, TypeScript, HTML, CSS, and then it's picked up as part of the front-end build process, and it's bundled into Hawt IO basically. And Hawt IO 2.0, which has just come out, aim to do more of this modular stuff, so that you can sort of basically package your own and choose what to have and not what to have. Now, the 1.5 version, everything is folders in the same place. So that's the direction they are going. Yeah. So if you like what you saw, I would encourage you to make use of it. I have contributed some myself, and I found that testing is very grateful for because you have You must remember you have all sorts of Java virtual machine, you have all sorts of operating systems and things like that. So if people find various edge cases, that's always nice. It's hard to know what to expect. You can contribute plugins. There's some changes ahead in both projects, making them more modular. Yeah, some references. I find both projects are very good, or quite intuitive to use, and the information is very useful. There's some existing content from JavaZone. That there's a more in-depth look at Jolokia, if you want to get into that. If you want a shorter demo to show to somebody, there's one in Norwegian a few years back. And I went very lightly on the plugin part. There's also one session that explains more about how plugins work. Any general questions, input?
Historical data, how ending had statistics last month. How would you handle that?
Well, you could write a little script or something. This is an interactive tool, so it's not a monitoring tool. But like, for instance, if you use a tool to monitor your application, you could interact with this. As you saw, I was able to extract that information. But it's a bit like also with the JConsole or wherever. You have some graphs and you basically take a screenshot. So if you want to sort of store statistics and stuff, that's will probably be some other kind of tools. I know there are certain agents that pick this out, but I don't have any good example at the moment. Yeah.
Are there any means to manage this information cluster or
Yeah. Well, this is per VM, so it does not support. So I could sort of see what instances there are and connect to each one individually, but the information is one-to-one with the VM. But with using Jolokia, you could make some tooling of your own. Like if you know you have a range of nodes and you want to extract the same information from each of them, you could do that. But as an interactive tool, it's meant for one tab per Java virtual machine. So it will not aggregate that in the interface for you. So then again, you would need to aggregate that somehow yourself. But if it's like certain identical information in an identical way to access it across a number of nodes, it shouldn't be too hard to use this as a basis for scripting, for instance. All right, then I would like to thank you so much for coming.